All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. We're excited. We got a 90-minute session. We're going to explore our question here posed for this four-session virtual speaker series, How Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Building Gets Funded. This is session 2 of 4. Our series is being co-produced by the Ecosystem Building Leadership Network, which is the organization I serve as the founding executive director of, which has grown out of the Kauffman Foundation eShip Summits and the Ecosystem Building Leadership Project. We'll talk a little bit more about that probably at the end. Also co-produced by the Entrepreneurship Funders Network. I have so many pictures on the screen here. I don't know if IFI Aduba or folks from EFN are here, but that is the largest network of foundations and funders that support entrepreneurship. They are a producing partner, Make Startups. Grace Belangia is co-producing with us on behalf of Make Startups, a national organization that provides a number of services for entrepreneurial ecosystem builders. One that is one of my favorites is their software platform to help not only track entrepreneurs across your ecosystems, but create measurable impact metrics. Make Startups is located in Georgia, but they work nationally. And actually, Grace, I think, is an East Coaster, West Coaster. So, Grace, if you're here, shout out. Let's do me a favor here because I am both speaking and emceeing. If someone wants to put Make Startups link into the meeting chat, that would be great. And if someone wants to put the Entrepreneurship Funders Network link into the chat, that would be great. And finally, the Startup Champions Network, Mark Lawrence, the board chair. Startup Champions Network is a 10-year-old organization and was one of the first national organizations dedicated, or really a professional association for entrepreneurial ecosystem builders. And Mark will be hosting our next session in June, which we'll get into at the end of this session. So hopefully you're in the right place. We're excited to have you. This is a collaboration across 4 organizations to help us explore probably the most common question I get asked in my work. I have been an entrepreneurial ecosystem builder primarily in Iowa. I helped start up the Startup Champions Network, then joined the Kauffman Foundation, worked there for 8 years supporting entrepreneurial ecosystem building and trying to advance the field, and recently stepped away from the Kauffman Foundation to step into the role as the founding executive director of the Ecosystem Building Leadership Network organization, really an alliance of many organizations, including all those we've mentioned today, working to advance the profession of entrepreneurial ecosystem building in the United States. I've been at it a long time, but our guest today has been at this type of work longer than most, if not all. I'm excited to introduce Don Mackey. Don is a longtime friend, mentor, and actually fellow Nebraskan. So I'm calling in from Omaha, and Don is over in Lincoln, Nebraska. So whereas our last session brought to you the story of Detroit, today Don will bring you some stories from Nebraska and Kansas here in the heartland. Don is the co-founder and vice president of E2 Entrepreneurial Ecosystems, which was formerly the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship. We'll get a little bit more into that story. Don is both a practitioner, an economist, an economic developer, a community leader, and has worked in more than 100 communities across the United States, and really is one of, if not the first pioneer of taking an ecosystem building approach, particularly in the context of a rural setting. Don's going to explore the stories today of Ord, Nebraska, Sidney, Nebraska, and Hutchinson, Kansas. And we're also going to hear a little bit about how our world, our field, entrepreneurship-led economic development, ecosystem building, community economic development that focuses on entrepreneurship, how that's evolved over the 50 years of Don's career. So I'm excited to welcome Don, and we could go into all sorts of directions, but Don, I'm going to just start with the question that's at the center of our conversation today, which is how entrepreneurial ecosystem building gets funded. So Don, I'm gonna ask you how to do that. I forgot my housekeeping. Rob Williams is joining us from SourceLink. Rob, wave or dance or do your best Taylor Swift impression. Rob is running the Zooms in the background, so he'll be hopefully helping curate some questions that come up in the Q&A. He'll be helping those of you who maybe have mute button challenges. If you want to come off, if you want to be on video, that's very welcome. If you can empathize with being a speaker and talking to wall names, but also understand some of you are working, doing the laundry, or on a run, that's also okay. We will make this recording available as well as the slides after this presentation, but encourage you to come off or to come onto video to help give Don an audience if you want, but also understand if there's another direction to go. If you do have any issues, Rob is the guy to reach out to, and if you have questions, go ahead and post them right in the main meeting chat, and we'll get to those as we move this on. Don's going to present for a bit. Then we're going to do a fireside chat and open it up for all folks to dive in. And as I said, if you have to leave early or you need to duck out, we will share the recording and the slides after the presentation is done. All right, Don, I've stalled enough. I've given you the question. Don, how does entrepreneurial ecosystem building get funded, or in your experience through your 50-year career helping entrepreneurs and communities? Where would you even start if I asked you, Don, how does entrepreneurial ecosystem building get funded?
Well, Andy, thanks for the introduction. Good day, everyone. It's great to be with you. As Andy and I have talked, I really think that providing robust, scalable, and predictable funding for ecosystem building and operation is possibly the biggest challenge we face in the field. And it has come up in every landscape where we've worked. The lack of funding has resulted in a lot of great initiatives that had promise to fail. And so I think developing new strategies of funding is just absolutely critical. So more than anxious, Andy, to share some thoughts. I'm going to share kind of a composite picture that draws on a number of different experiences. So in the good old days, since Andy's made the point of my age, when we were doing traditional economic development, the classic funding model across the United States, any community of any size, was a capital campaign. We would develop a strategy, 3 to 5 years, that we were going to employ to go out and create economic development in our community or region, or for that matter, at the state level. And then we would go out and raise that money, whether that was $1 million or a $5 million campaign, where local banks and philanthropists and business owners and local government and the county would all pitch in to capitalize that campaign. And what that did is it provided predictable funding. So that's one of the adaptations I think we should think about, is the use of that tool. The second is, as some of you know, at the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, we also did a lot of work in community development philanthropy. And we got into that work because we were looking for money to fund entrepreneurial ecosystem building and operation. And so drawing from the philanthropic experience, I think there's an important connection. Mark Burdett out of West Virginia and I were talking about this morning, and that is, if we look at our communities and our regions, the vast majority of household wealth is tied to successful entrepreneurial families. In my home state of Nebraska, there are about 67,000 millionaires. I can't quantify it exactly, but based on our field experience, typically 80% of those households created their wealth by having a locally owned manufacturing plant. They had a physician's clinic, you name it, they created it through an entrepreneurial venture. And these folks typically want to give back to their community, but there's also this connection that they made their life, they created their identity, they achieved their wealth by being entrepreneurs. And the idea of them supporting an ecosystem that would help other entrepreneurs do that for the communities they love, the states that they call home, we think there's a powerful value case. And some of the stories, Andy, when we get into that, will speak to people who have actually begun to test the waters on this connection. So one of the things we found, and then I'll stop and we can go into your questions, is if you want to achieve transformative change and really root entrepreneurship in the culture of a community or a region, making it a mainstay economic development strategy, we find that you really should have a 10-year or a decade-long perspective. And so when you think about that, what we had been toying with Sydney which is we'll talk about more about Sidney, Nebraska, is the idea of initially about 3 years of seed funding. And, generally communities can find that a grant from someone, a donor that puts up some money they scrape together from the city, the county, and the development corp to get started, to begin to do proof of concept. But the day you start that seed funding, start spending it, the groundwork should be laid for a 3 to 5 year capital campaign, so that as you begin to lay out and achieve success with your ecosystem, generating stories and metrics like startups and expansions and job creation and those kinds of things, getting ready for a much more substantial 3 to 5 year capital campaign that says, here's our plan for the next 5 years, and we want to raise $1 million a year to capitalize that. That provides assurances that you can staff up, you can hang on to staff, you can really work your plan. And as you start that next capital campaign, then you can transition, drawing from philanthropy, what we call donor underwriting. Begin to talk. So, for example, in Sidney, we mapped all the successful entrepreneurial families and said, what if you were to bring together and start talking to 25 of those families to say, would you make a commitment? Would you provide donor underwriting through your community fund with your foundation to ensure we have another 3 to 5 years of funding? So you kind of transition from the capital campaign to really moving to depend on philanthropy funded by successful entrepreneurial families. And as you start that, and then I'll stop, Andy, you begin to plant the seeds with those families and others to say, now, would you consider making a legacy gift, an endowed gift, to create an endowment to provide core perpetual funding for the ecosystem work? That's what we do in higher education. That's what we do with private schools. That's what we do with hospitals. This is all technology that communities have familiarity with. We've just never really applied it in the entrepreneurial ecosystem space. So that's a vision for how this could work. When we get into the stories, Andy, we can talk about examples of it actually happening.
Yeah, I think that's great. And one of the key points I'm taking away from that, what you just said there, and you used, when we started to set this up, you talked about this notion of fundraising technologies, right? So, well, you don't mean an iPhone or AI. You mean literally the tools that we raise money. And I think I'll speak for I'm only a couple years younger than you, because you're like 45 or something. But I think a lot of folks who do ecosystem building work, we feel like we're innovators, or we're entrepreneurial, or we're pirates. And so we got to invent the new thing all the time. And I'm as guilty as anybody else on that one. But what you're essentially saying is there are technologies, lowercase t, where economic developers, community developers have raised money historically for more traditional ways of economic development. And one of the things that folks in ecosystem building who think they're the pirates and the renegades and the rebels could actually look at those things and use those, but frame them maybe less for building a research park or a industrial site, but to apply it to how we fund this. And so the capital campaign is your good example. And what I'll tell you, the first time you said that to me, I was like, God, that sounds boring, right? But what you're actually saying is these are tried and true and tested ways of raising money. But then your insight, I think, in what you shared is then link it back to the entrepreneurial families. And so you said there are 67,000 roughly millionaires in the state of Nebraska. Just for context, how many people are in the state of Nebraska total?
Well, 2 million. And if you look at households, it's less than 1 million households.
Yeah. So you're saying within less than 1 million household, there's 67,000 people that are high net worth individuals. And then many of those, or maybe even most of those, acquired that wealth through entrepreneurial ventures or were the wealth created by entrepreneurial ventures. And so the ability to tap into that to then almost pay it forward or pay it back, I don't know which direction it goes, is a source of funding for ecosystem building that ultimately aims to create more entrepreneurs. And that those folks, those high net worth individuals, want to give back. But sometimes the pathway for them to do that is harder than to give to entrepreneurs than it is to say support the local arts institution. Nothing against the arts institution. So what you're really getting at is a capital campaign and other technologies of raising money that help those folks have an easy pathway. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Two things. One is I want to emphasize in our world, we're convinced that core funding for ecosystem building and operation has to come from within the community, from within the region. And so that's got to be the root. You can go leverage outside money to help do things, but the core base operating budget should come locally, and this becomes a way to do that. I think the second thing, Andy, that we've learned from our community development philanthropy work across the country is unless these donors are pitched a vision and asked, yeah, they're going to give to the Arts Council because the Arts Council knows how to ask them. And until we as ecosystem builders begin to have those conversations and say, look at what you could do for your community, for the future of people in this community, they may never think of that until you pitch it. And that's the key with this whole strategy is you've got to begin to talk to these folks, share the vision, share the plan, and begin to get them excited. And again, this is philanthropy donor development 101. There's a lot of people in your community and state that know how to do this. You just need to bring them in as partners and help you adapt it to what you're doing.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, that point there's really strong too, which is like, again, I sometimes think as especially when I was doing local work in Iowa, that I'm like doing super innovative stuff. But fundraising is fundraising, and this is a capital campaign is a process, and there are consultants and people probably in everyone's community who will be happy to show you how to do that. And I think I was on the board of a new independent movie theater, and we did a capital campaign, and we hired this person who knew how to track donors, who knew how to make target lists, who knew how to make asks. But instead of asking for, the film theater, which is also awesome and important, you're asking for to help fund the future of entrepreneurship and those in that person's community. And
Yeah.
it seems so straightforward when you say it that way, but it seems so hard when you actually do it in life. So I like that.
But that's innovation, is adapting knowledge we already have and applying it in a different field. And that's all we're doing here. We're
Sure.
creating innovation on the edge.
Yeah. And so in a second, we're going to talk about donor advised funds and community foundations, because that's a key tool that you've used in many of the communities you worked in. And you've got great examples from those three communities we talked about. But we dove right in because I went with a big question and we may have lost some people. So what I want to do is let's do the part. Let's go back to the part where we should just tell a couple stories. So a number of years ago, I was given a newspaper clipping by my mother. So I don't know if anyone's mother gives you newspaper clippings. My mother could probably give a fairly decent TED talk on ecosystem building, but 10 years ago, she could not. She's listened enough. But she cut out a story about a town called Ord, Nebraska. It was in the Omaha paper called the World Herald. And the story was, here's this little tiny town in the middle of Nebraska in the most unexpected place. And I think it actually said something like, the only reason Ord is here is because it used to be the end of a railroad spur, but it's not on a major river. It's not on the interstate. Nebraska is a pretty vast geography, but it said something special is happening here. There is entrepreneurship culture that is spread across the town. There are small businesses lining Main Street, that every kid in town was getting exposed to entrepreneurship education through 4-H and through the schools. And my mom handed this to me and she goes, I think this has something to do with what you do. And I took it. I didn't know what to do with it. And I pinned it to a board in my office and it sat there for 6 years. And then I joined the Kauffman Foundation in 2017 or 16. And my boss at the time, and for those of you who know Victor Huang, said, the goal here is to advance entrepreneurial ecosystem building as a profession and as a part of economic development. And that there's lots of people doing it around the country, but we don't have, a lot of coherence and consensus on how you do it. And so we started getting folks together, but we needed some examples and we needed some stories and we needed some case studies on how this work happens. And I went back to that little article that my mom had given me maybe 6 years earlier. And I had never been to Ord. I had lived in Nebraska for chunks of my life. And that led me to you. And we had met in passing, but I said, what do you know about Ord? And you said, a lot. I've been working with that community for 25 years. And so that led us down a path where we were able to work together, E2 Ecosystems, Network Kansas, uh, and the Nebraska Community Foundation and the Kauffman Foundation to develop a case study and eventually a course around the story of what's happening in Ord. So we can't cover all of it in the next, time we have, but can you just tell us a story about Ord, Nebraska, where it was, what it did, and what happened as it relates to entrepreneurship, ecosystem building, and revitalization or re-energizing of that town?
I'd love to. And I'm going to actually share a graphic to just kind of give you the overarching view of the storyline.
Great.
So this really spans the better part of 50 years. And so Ord, Nebraska is a community of about 2,000 people. Its county is 4,000. It anchors a very rural region with about 10,000 residents in north central Nebraska. And it is a community that historically was rooted in commodity agriculture. So for communities in the Great Plains that are like that, and there are thousands of them, in the 1970s, you could describe Ord as a community that was seeing substantial mechanization in ag, and so consolidation with slow declines in population and business losses. So it was kind of this slow death that was happening throughout the Great Plains region. But, other parts of the country, you can look at the fishing communities in Maine or the timber communities in the Pacific Northwest or the mining communities in Arizona, similar stories. Then in the 1980s, we had the agricultural crisis. Russia invaded Afghanistan. There was the commodity embargoes. Agriculture went into crisis, and Ord, like so many other communities, experienced this very dramatic decline, massive net out migration of residents, lots of businesses on Main Street boarded up. This is the age when we had the crisis hotlines because people who had been on the farm for 5 generations were taking their lives because I'm the one that lost the farm during the crisis. So it was a very wrenching period. And it was during this period that Bob Stoll, who grew up there, one of these outstanding young men, went to West Point, served in Vietnam, was a hero in Vietnam in saving his troops from destruction, came home and looked around and goes, this isn't the community I know, and I don't know if this is the community where I want to raise my family unless it changes. And so this crisis precipitated what we called in the 1990s the search for solutions. Ord started networking, and Bob created a small band of people that got together and they visited other communities. They talked to folks. This is when we met them and began to work with them. And Bob became very, very interested in entrepreneurship. He goes, I'm an entrepreneur. I have a law business. My wife has the Five and Dime store. I've got other family and friends that have businesses. This makes sense. And so really the critical event was in 2000 when Bob organized a group of 10 leaders. That became a group of 100 champions. And for the first time in over 40 years, Ord enacted by a vote of the people a tax on itself to raise funds to support community economic development. And the bulk of that money was dedicated to entrepreneurship. So this is really the first community we had a chance to say, what does a community-based ecosystem look like? How can it operate? So that's part of the richness of the story. And what happened is between 2000, when they got organized, they generated about $1 million a year in a community of 2,000 that's working this multi-county region of 10,000. And that's where we came up with this idea of the ground game. This simple proposition, and Ord field tested it. Their economic developer's number one job, their first economic developer that was paid was hired in 2000. Her job was to go out and just talk to entrepreneurs, talk to local business people. What are you doing? What are you struggling with? How could we help you? And out of that, they began to identify the resources that they needed to make available in this community and in this region to support entrepreneurship. By 2010, in our case study, thanks to Andy and the Kauffman Foundation and others, we invested almost $200,000 in this case study. we began to document that Ord was actually achieving material change. And we compared it to communities in Kansas, similar communities in Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota that looked exactly like Ord. And Ord was really beginning to separate itself in terms of its prosperity, more wealth, more jobs, better jobs, a dramatically improved tax base, both sales tax and property taxes, which kept the county and the city at the table. And what's interesting is by the late 2010s, around the pandemic, a lot of communities were challenged. Ord had really begun to lose their way. And then a former economic developer who was involved with this early on started a brew pub, Caleb Pollard. So if you stop in Ord, you want to buy one of his brews. Came back as the economic developer, and he has totally re-energized their entrepreneurship strategy, and they are on a roll. He's going to do about 60 new deals this year throughout this region, continuing to build the economy. So I'll stop the share, Andy, but there's so much more we can share about this story. But for me, this was a proof of concept. I wasn't convinced that this strategy could bring about material transformative change in a community, but the Ord experience over these last 25 years or so has demonstrated to me that it's possible. And now that's been replicated in lots of communities throughout rural America. We believe this can make a fundamental difference in communities.
There's so much more richness in that story that we can't cover now, but I am going to share this. There's Rob shared, I think, a link to the entire resource case study, and there's an entire course you can actually self-guided course you can take. If you only have time to read one thing, the PDF I just shared is a great long format journalistic piece by the journalist Matthew Hansen, who writes with the Flatwater Free Press, and it's just the narrative story of Bob Stoll. And Bob would never call him, well, I don't know if he would never, probably had never called himself an ecosystem builder. But when you meet Bob, you see how he works across the system, that he invites people in, that he gets people to collaborate, that he paints a vision of a future that doesn't yet exist. And if you ever have a chance to meet him, he is the pinnacle of what an ecosystem builder is. And he didn't have any formal training in that, but he does cite a lot of his work from in the military of how he learned how to lead groups of people from behind, he said. But the story is really incredible. There's so many, if you go to the link that Rob shared, you can get the entire economic analysis that basically showed Ord is going the opposite direction, positive up and to the right from all but like 2 or 3 communities, right? Don, it's like economic performance is outperforming all but 2 or 3 other small communities in the Midwest. Yeah. But my favorite statistic, because I've had the fortunate opportunity to go, thanks to you, Don, and other folks, to tour around, and folks talk about the culture change of the place over 10 years from a culture of scarcity to a culture of abundance from a culture of fear to a culture of agency, the belief that you could do anything. And Bob said to me once, he goes, we had to practice overcoming crises, but now we've been doing it so long, it's actually really exciting because we get to activate everyone to work together. But my favorite sort of impact statistic came up on one of my trips. And someone said, well, we have a lot more, since 20 years of work, 30 years of work, we've been, one of our indicators of success is boomerang in-laws. And I was like, what is a boomerang in-law? And they said, well,
sounds scary to me.
Yeah, and I was like, exactly. I was like, what is that? And the person said, well, a kid from Ord grows up and then goes to Omaha or Denver, Kansas City or Des Moines or Minneapolis or, Harvard for college. They move to the big city, they meet a partner. They eventually move back to Ord with that partner. And then the partner's parents show up to visit the grandkids. And they think they're coming from Kansas City to Little Ord. And then they get there and they go, whoa, it's kind of nice around here. I like that brew pub. I like the main street. I like the way it feels. And then the in-laws move to Ord. And the person who was at the time who told me this said, we actually track that now as an economic development statistic. And there's a lot of things you can track, but when you're attracting people from bigger cities because of the quality of life, it's just one of the outcomes of a thriving entrepreneurial ecosystem. But I think it's a great story, and there's no way we're going to be able to cover cover the whole story here, but part of why I wanted you to tell is one, it's a great story, and Matthew Hansen's written story is even more powerful because it dives into how hard it was for Bob as the ecosystem builder in that community, but that he's activated so many other people to do that work. But what I want to get at in that org story, because it's back to the question of how do you fund this work? You mentioned that they passed a local income sales tax to fund economic development, generated about $1 million initially. A piece of the story is before that they had a farmer or a couple that owned a farm
the
that
Wozabs.
they contributed some money in their will. So tell that piece. And then what I want to actually get into is the donor advised fund model that you sort of pioneered that. So tell me about that, the original contribution, and then let's talk a little bit about sort of you call it community philanthropy or community foundation, how the community foundation plays in the org story. So go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll go right there. So read The Long Drive Home if you have a chance. There's also 2 videos on that website. One that was done by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in the early 2000s that kind of captured ORD when it was still trying to get its act together. And then one by the Nebraska Community Foundation with funding from Andy through the Kauffman Foundation that was done 20 years later that really captures the story. So you might want to look at those videos. But to your question, philanthropy is really interesting. So yeah, there was this couple, John and Alice Wozab, not super wealthy, but they had built an estate. They left a couple $1 million to the county. The county goes, we don't want to take this money because it would cause us to have to cut back on our tax rate because of state law. And so it was the nucleus of creating the Valley County Community Foundation Fund within the Nebraska Community Foundation Fund. And today, ORD is a community that has generated significant endowments through that fund. I think what it's important is while they've funded their base entrepreneurship work through that tax levy that is annual, they've renewed it now twice with a vote of the people. They use their foundation funds to do a number of other things. So their youth entrepreneurship work is all funded out of donor advised funds within their community foundation. They have something called the Sinovation Valley Leadership Academy, which is an entrepreneurship leadership academy for entrepreneurs, their families, their employees, and their employees' spouses. And this would have been from the a few years back, but almost 30% of the residents of ORD have gone through that leadership academy. So they use the foundation to really seed some things that has made a huge difference, augmenting where most of their tax dollars are used to pay for staff and to provide gap financing for these entrepreneurial ventures.
Can I interject on that Leadership Academy? So the original donation came from the couple, and there was a lot of like, what do we do with it? And my understanding of the story, and correct me if I'm telling it wrong, that Bob's tells is they were like, we don't know, but it was left with the vague notion of improve the community. So they ran around the country, they talked to the Nebraska Community Foundation, other folks. Yeah. They settled on 3 pillars. They settled on entrepreneurship, economic development, and leadership. And the leadership piece to me was the thing that was actually highlighted in that newspaper article that I saw. And I've spent enough time there and obviously read all of your case study work. Super key because it wasn't a leadership academy for entrepreneurs on its face. It was just a leadership academy for adults. And it's a very intense 2-year program that uses linguistic reprogramming, which probably that's another webinar. But you change your language to change your mindset, essentially. And what people told me about it was you go into it thinking you're going to get some lessons on how to do strategic plans, but what you learn is to have a mindset of abundance, an entrepreneurial mindset, and that in a world that shifting your mindset from that scarcity to abundance, and that you have the agency to do whatever you want to do. And what came out of my conversations with folks was like couple folks who basically said like once a percentage of our town went through that, and it actually shifted the entire culture of our town, not just to be more entrepreneurial, but to be more sort of a culture of abundance with that agency piece. And then someone told me, and I may be paraphrasing this wrong, but someone said the gentleman who ran the sanitation department at the city got into the program and again, it's a really intense program, 2 years. Um, and that it was he had such a life-changing experience that he required everybody at the sanitation department to take the course. To put that, with respect to those folks in that job, I said, if your garbage men are going through your leadership academy in a community, that's a sign something is going real well. And
Yeah.
that what I this is much my hypothesis, but about 10% of the count of the community has gone through that program over was about 10 years. And then they're doing also similar entrepreneurship and leadership with the youth. So that culture change is happening and funded by this donor advised fund, which is this parallel thing. And we're not even talking directly about entrepreneurship, but then a lot of people that come out of that program ultimately end up becoming entrepreneurs. Am I characterizing that all well done? I'm sort of that might be the cartoon version. I might have cut
Yeah,
some.
no, absolutely. But it speaks to the fact that most of the donors to their foundation are successful entrepreneurial families. Now, they didn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm an entrepreneur, but they were and they have been. And that idea that, oh, we're a successful entrepreneurial family and we can give back to the community is a pretty big motivator. It contributes to that culture change you're talking about, Andy.
Yeah, so let's do this because people have signed up for this to get a model. I know you have a slide over there that gives us a little bit of the generic model that you've built with E2 ecosystems you've implemented in many communities that involve the donor advised, the community philanthropy. Could we pull that slide up
Yeah.
for those who are waiting for the don't bury the lead moment?
All
But also
right.
then we can talk a little bit about Sydney. We can talk a little bit about Hutchinson, and then y'all who are listening, you got some questions, so start putting those in the chat because we're gonna start getting into those. But Don, walk us through this model. You have a on your website, if anyone is flipping through on the side through Don's website, the Entrepreneurial Ecosystem or the E2 Ecosystems website, there's unlimited material. And some of the challenges I have is just there's so much good stuff. So I'm going to point out a couple things. I gave you the Matt Hansen version of the story, and then I'm going to point out Don's guide that has this model in it. We will share it obviously in the recording for the video. But Don, walk us through this model. This is, I would say, greatly informed by Ord, and you've
Mhm.
shared this model with many communities, and you could tell us how it's been implemented in different ways. But give us this model. This is the answer to how to entrepreneurial ecosystem building get funded based on Don's decades of work in this space.
So it's a theory of change model, but it's post action. And so it's rooted in Ord's experiences in other communities, Keene, New Hampshire, Klamath Falls, Oregon. We can go through a long list. And, it's stylized, it's simplified, but it gives you an idea of the transformations that happen when you support entrepreneurship. So it begins with this idea, and this was Ord's motivation. It's the motivation in most communities I have is the community wants to increase their prosperity, better jobs, better tax base, more money to support the arts, all of those kinds of things that we could use in defining prosperity. And what the theory shows based in reality is if you can increase entrepreneurial behavior, not just entrepreneurs, but entrepreneurial behavior, and it speaks to the fact that you were talking about with the garbage folks. This is a mindset, this is a culture, this is a way of behaving and thinking. You can begin to put into motion a number of things that become transformative. The first is the community becomes more competitive. One of the transformations in Ord is they went from a community where they had net sales tax losses because people were going outside of the community to shop to where it's now a retail and service hub. And so a lot of their tax base is being paid for by people coming into the community, shopping and using those services, which keeps the city at the table. So you get that kind of increased competitiveness, but distributed across all of these ventures from for-profit businesses, nonprofits like the healthcare system on down the line. The other thing that we've documented in this theory of change model is it inherently diversifies not only the economy. So Ord went from a two-sector economy, commodity ag and a area trade center, to an 8-sector economy over 20 years. But it also leads to social diversification. You talked about the boomerang. You are now attracting people into the community that are bringing other experiences, broader values, different ideas. And so you also have social diversification, which tends to energize the whole process. Those two things combined contribute to a higher value added. When I first went to Ord in the 1990s, we went to the local cafe, and it was one of those standard chicken fried steak meals. You get unlimited salad bar and dessert, and it was like $5. And I turned to Bob Stoll and I go, how can they afford to make a living, even back then, selling to me? And he goes, because that's all that people can afford to pay. It was a community that saw itself as poor because it was largely poor. What we've now seen in Ord is there's substantially higher incomes, higher net worth, and it is a much richer community because they have a higher value economy that allows them to do a whole lot more things. That then generates resilience. And for any community, for any entrepreneur, for any organization, resilience, that ability to weather challenges and storms. And so if you go to the case study and read David Iaquinta's stories about how Ord managed through COVID-19, you'll get a sense for how this ecosystem, this culture, really sustained them through what you might call an ultimate stress test that really damaged a lot of communities. And then that comes full cycle. With increased prosperity, you generate more wealth, and that's the philanthropic connection. There are now more entrepreneurs in Ord who are wealthier, who have the capacity to give back to the community, and you have this ethic that giving back to the community is worthwhile. What we've not done is intentionally connected to that, to creating an endowment, not in Ord, but in other communities, to support entrepreneurial ecosystem building and operation. So Andy, was that what you wanted me to kind of cover in terms of the basic theory of the change model?
And I think the flywheel is more entrepreneurship creates ultimately all those great things, including more prosperity, which creates more opportunity for those entrepreneurs successful to give back. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about community development philanthropy, because all those words may be new to somebody who's listening. So let me just ask you a real basic question. For some of you, you may know this, but can you just help us with a couple words? I hear economic development, I hear community development, I hear community economic development. Are those all the same things? Or how, like, for somebody who's maybe doing this type of work but doesn't come from those backgrounds, can you just help us with those terms? Because I frankly get a little confused sometimes myself.
Well, first of all, I can define them as we use them. The reality is, and this is part of the challenge for communities, is those terms all mean different things to different people. If you talk to the Nebraska Department of Economic Development, they're going to primarily talk about business attraction, and that's economic development because that's where most of their money goes. And so let's start with our definition. So first of all, in our work, we're really focused around community-centered community economic development. Are we in fact helping the community become more prosperous? And what that implies is we're helping the residents of that community to a better place, a better tax base so you can support better schools, better parks, all of those kinds of things. And so there's a strong connection between why do we do economic development and why do we have an economy? It should be to benefit the people who live in that community. So that's a value case. And Andy, that then gets us to community development philanthropy. And what that means is really intentionally, and this comes out of the great work of Janet Topolsky, retired from the Aspen Institute, Deb Markley, who was my colleague at the center, a whole group of people who said, okay, philanthropy shouldn't exist just to help donors give money away, which is what it has primarily done for the last 100 years. There is an opportunity, and when we get into the Sydney story and the Hutchinson story, we can in fact focus philanthropy to support things like ecosystem building and operation that contributes to not only a stronger economy, but a better economy in terms of its equity of wealth and income distribution across the population. So there's some embedded values in how we use these terms, but for communities, depending on which conference they go to, you're going to get different definitions because it's coming from the perspective of how other people define these terms.
Okay, that's great. And just to help do that in our own little world of this webinar. Can you tell us when you say ecosystem building, what you mean by that?
Okay,
And maybe how
again,
that's different from direct entrepreneurial support or related.
yeah. So in our case, again, that community focus, and I'm going to actually, if I can, show another one just to answer
Right.
that, Andy.
Yeah.
There's a time where I couldn't navigate this without screwing up, and so
Zoom,
life is
Zoom
better.
keeps adding pieces. There you go. Okay. Yeah, we see it. Yep.
Okay, so it's something you said at the first summit that I put in my notebook, and I still have it with your name attached to it. And that is, you made a comment, you may not, well, you should claim it, that every community has entrepreneurial talent, but not every community has an ecosystem that supports that entrepreneurial talent. And we took that to heart, and that's become embedded in our models. So the idea is the community has to start with the entrepreneurial talent it has. It may not have a bunch of high growth businesses. It may not have certain things, but start with what you have. Then understand that if you're willing to talk to those entrepreneurs and actually identify what they need, you may find, I don't need venture capital. What I need is great gap financing that can help this entrepreneur get a bank loan and to get to the next stage in their growth. And so find those relevant resources. And what we found, at least in rural America, most of those resources are within 50 miles of that community. There are attorneys, there are CPAs, there are banks, there are programs that can help them. But if you have that entrepreneur who is like, USA Popcorn in Valley County near Ord that sells popcorn all over the world, well, Caleb has to network them to resources outside of that community to help them with market research and those kinds of things. In our model, the role of the community is to reach out to those entrepreneurs, learn what their needs and wants are, and then attempt to network them to relevant resources. And so we use the term navigation. This isn't even business coaching. This is simply people like AJ and Marissa and others taking the time to learn and listen to say, oh, we can help you connect to a bank. We can connect you to a loan fund. We can get you a technical resource. And when you do that, and that's what Ord did, in our case study, we looked at 100 entrepreneurial nascent startups and expansions. You get impact. What's interesting out of those 100, 95 are still in operation today. Really neat. So this is the essence of what we mean by community-centered entrepreneurial ecosystem. You could have an accelerator, you can have an incubator, you can have all these things, but at the end of the day, this is demand-driven by the needs and the wants of the entrepreneurs in your community that you are working with.
That's great. Thank you, Don. Very helpful and level setting. Okay, we're gonna get a little bit more into donor advised funds, but Gustavo has a question for you, which is a good one. So how do you raise the initial funding to support the ecosystem or the donor advised fund in a community that doesn't have millionaire families?
Well, first of all, almost every community has millionaire families. They may not be living in your community. They grew up there, they've gone away, they still care, they probably get the local newspaper. But again, we've done this work on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota, one of the poorest places in the United States. And there is wealth and there are resources. And so this is asset-based development. For those of you that are familiar with ABDC, you start with what you have. And what we found, and this goes to your point, Andy, about abundance, there is more there than you think as you begin to turn it over. Now, is this going to be harder to do in Central Appalachia in the hollows? Absolutely, because there's less wealth, there's less resources, there's more poverty. Nevertheless, this has worked in Central Appalachia in some of the smallest villages and towns in that part of the country. And so I guess I'm just reframing it and saying there's more there to work with than you think. And if this can work in Central Appalachia, if it can work on the Rosebud Reservation, I'm convinced. If it can work in Ord, Ord was a poor community when it started. It's a much more wealthy community today. But they saw it as a deficit. There wasn't enough to work with and discovered there was more to get started, and then you grow it. Then you grow it. I don't know if that helps with your question, but part of our
Getting the
work is to help
positive nod.
communities discover what are the
Yeah.
assets you have.
Well, and also shout out to Gustavo, who's with the National Main Street Center, who's working in 3 or 4 Nebraska towns. National Main Street Center helps ecosystem building through Main Street offices. So lots that probably Gustavo and you and Doug can
Yeah.
talk about. I'm going to keep rolling along here. I'm going to get into the donor advised funds in just a second, but there is one question from Kate that's been hanging out for a bit. Thinking about Ord, thinking about your other communities, her question is, in the early stages, what did the majority of funding support look like, and how did that change as the plan moved? And you can say that specifically in order, generically across. How does that funding sources change from the beginning to maybe a decade into one of these projects?
So let me use 2 examples. In Ord in the 1990s, like most stressed rural communities, the idea was, we're just going to kind of bootstrap it, work with volunteers, maybe a part-time staff person who turns over every 6 months. And they didn't make a lot of progress. And that was part of the reason when Bob Stoll and his gang got together, they said, Bob in the long drive home gives 3 pieces of advice. One is you have to really support this kind of soft leadership or empowering leadership, and that's why they have that. You have to be willing to invest in your ecosystem and in your community, and you really have to embrace entrepreneurship. And so to come back to the investment part, in Ord, they took 2 years to build the case, to go to the taxpayers, to pass an initiative referendum, to assess an additional sales tax to fund this work. And it barely passed, but it did pass. And as I mentioned before, it had been decades before this community had increased taxes on themselves. And that provided their base. And then philanthropy and other things happened. But in most communities, the way it starts is the community gets, and this goes to my earlier comments, it secures some funds. So if we look at Sidney, Nebraska, which we'll talk more about later, hopefully, they were initially bootstrapping this, but then they found 3 partners. And it wasn't the likely suspects, because the likely suspects like the Development Corp, the city, the county, the tourism group, the chamber all said, this is interesting, but we're not sure we're willing to play. So the core group of champions said, okay, the school district wants to play, the public school, they're willing to provide staff positions. The community college wants to play. They have a campus in Sidney, and we'll provide office space, technology, and all of that. And then a local donor who had a donor advice fund stepped up and said, I'll provide you 3 years of funding at $250,000 a year. Now, this is an anonymous donor, but everybody knows it's one of the Cabela's who created Cabela's Corporation that no longer is in Sidney. And so most communities start with that grub stake. Where they get into trouble is when you've kind of spent that first 2-3 years of funding, they have not done the work to lay out a strategy to secure funding for that next 3 to 5 years. And that's why we come back to this idea that when you get that first chunk, you got to dedicate time and energy to start laying the groundwork for that next funding chunk and ultimately begin to build an endowment that gives you perpetual core support.
That's great. Let's do this. I'm going to talk about donor advised funds because I know that's what I keep saying. But you started the Sidney story. Just tell us the beginning, the middle, end of the Sidney story. It's a pretty amazing one. Set the context for us. Sidney could not be further from anywhere, and the size of it. And then tell us its story.
So let me give the MO. Sidney, Nebraska is out in the Nebraska Panhandle. It's closer to Denver than it is to Lincoln or Omaha. Sidney is a community of about 6,000. The county's about 9,000. It's very low population. This is high plains, so population and moisture really thins out as you go west in the Great Plains. Sidney is a community that always focused on the home run, and they've gone through 7 different boom and busts where huge prosperity, the one industry that brought them to prosperity leaves or ceases to exist. They go into crash and then they come back again. So the last time around, Sydney achieved prosperity because of the Cabela brothers. And so if you're familiar with it, Cabela's outdoor uh, sporting goods outfitters, recently bought in 2017 by Bass Pro Shop. In Sydney, Cabela's had built their corporate headquarters, and at the apex in the mid 2015 period, they had 2,000 corporate employees in this community of 6,000. Okay. By 2019, those 2,000 employees were gone. And you can imagine what happened to the community, the economic crash. What makes Sydney interesting is a lot of those former Cabela's employees who were trained in national and international corporate activities from marketing to human resources. Some of them chose to stay and come back to the community. And they became the nucleus of the Champions Group. So one of the questions we're always asked is, well, ORD took 20 years. Does every community have to take 20 years? And I go, I don't know, but probably. But in Sydney's case, they achieved a turnaround in about 6 years. And they committed to entrepreneurship, saying, we've got all of this legacy Cabela's talent that didn't leave. We're going to support these folks. And so in the last 3 years, they have done 114 entrepreneurial deals. Now, that's pretty huge. And while their population isn't quite back to where it was before Cabela's left, it's close. And they have a much more diversified economy where these 100 or so businesses are in all sorts of markets. And Andy, I would say they have cultivated a core entrepreneurial culture quicker than any community I've witnessed in my experience. So it's really neat, and we've got a great case study of Sydney as well on our website that you can take a look at. But the amount of time that they managed to do this is remarkable, but it goes back to they had a champions group that, first of all, could benefit. I mean, one of the first things they did is they started talking to Ord and Bob Stoll and say, how did you do it? They networked to folks who had been there and done that. And so that shortened their curve because they had confidence in their strategy and embraced it much more quickly and then capitalized it with real money.
One of the things that I have not actually, I've been to Sydney, which is a good claim to fame, but I haven't been to tour the ecosystem work there. But one of the things that's amazing to me is a bunch of those 100 and whatever number you said of new entrepreneurial ventures in this town of 6,000 people, or actually less, it's like 4,000 now. A lot of them, not surprisingly, are e-commerce and outdoor apparel related companies, because the people that were doing it for Cabela's were literally the best in the world for e-commerce, outdoor apparel, and accessories, hunting equipment. And so when the company moved the corporate headquarters, they didn't want to move. It was their hometown. So there's a group of guys doing a innovative backpack outdoor gear and all sorts of interesting cooking and camping gear. And they're like the best in the world at it. They know how Cabela's does it because they did it for Cabela's, and they're using that, and they're staying in Sydney. And now I think with Zoom and high-speed internet, it like doesn't really matter where your outdoor brand is at, as long as you know how to access the industry and obviously use the tools.
Yeah, I mean, these are basically small corporate headquarters. So you're creating really high-end jobs in marketing, human resources. They probably aren't manufacturing in Sydney, but you've got these corporate headquarters. I think the other thing, Andy, that contributed to Sydney is, again, this goes back to asset-based development. When Cabela's left, their housing market crashed. At one point, there were 500 homes on the market in this community of 6,000. And Cabela said, COVID's coming on. We're going to market to the Denver Front Range that we've got affordable, available housing. Within 18 months, they filled every one of those houses, brought in new households into the community, and about 10% of those households have started, bought, or expanded businesses.
It's awesome.
And again, it's like we've got this crisis. The realtors got together and said, oh, we're going to market to Denver and say, you can buy a house here for $180,000 that would cost you $700,000 in Denver.
Yeah, I tried to buy houses in Denver. I'm not buying houses in Denver. You could buy 5 houses in Sydney that you could buy
Yeah.
one in Denver.
Yeah.
So Sydney's sort of your latest case study. You started doing that work with Sydney, actually through a program that the Koch Foundation helped
Yeah.
fund. Let's use that story as a way to talk about donor advised funds. So I would say this is your, I don't know, version 25 of your model. But how are they used? First, let's start there. What is a community foundation? What is a donor advised fund? Let's just start there
Okay.
because those are words that not everyone understands, and frankly, I didn't fully understand it until I worked at a foundation. So what's a community foundation, and what's a donor advised fund? And then we will talk about the model. So start with those two questions.
So to me, community foundations are probably one of the most powerful tools we have available to us. And under IRS law, there's all kinds of nonprofit charitable organizations that enjoy, you know, the ability to give a tax break to a donor. But a community foundation is really structured to make it easier for donors, communities, and organizations to set up a foundation within the architecture of the host community foundation. So in Nebraska, we have the Nebraska Community Foundation. It has 400 plus communities that have foundations like Ord and Sydney under that umbrella. And it creates economies of scale so the community can really focus on what do they want to do and donor development, raising those money and spending those monies. So the community foundation, if you don't have one in your community, look at how you could get one. If you do, and then when we get to the Hutch story, we'll talk about why this is important. See if you can make them a partner because they are a powerful resource. Now, one of the things within a community foundation you can do. So if you are a high net worth donor and you want to create a fund, you can go create your private foundation, but you have to take on all the overhead and the staffing to do that. Or you can create the equivalent of a private foundation through a donor advised fund where it's set up and managed, the costs are cheaper, you can pool for investment within the community foundation. And but the donor advisory group has the ability to advise and direct how those funds are used. So in the case of Sydney, they have a multi-million-dollar donor advice fund. And when we reached that point that Bob Stoll told Sarah Sennett and her gang in Sydney, if you're going to do this, put real money into it. Sarah started partnering with the Nebraska Community Foundation that was managing that donor fund, advice fund and said, can we make a pitch to these folks? And they did. And they secured that initial funding. And now they're engaging other donors in building out that fund. It's a powerful tool, but you need a community foundation partner who's willing to work with you.
In my understanding, and if someone on here is from a community foundation, feel free to chime in. My understanding too is that most community foundations, they're happy to create a bucket of money as long as you are willing to help them fill it.
Exactly.
And so if you say, I want to start the Don Mackey Fund for youth soccer, they're happy to have that fund as long as Don is going to go out and figure out how to fill it. But the advantage of the fund is just like a family foundation, a corporate foundation, there's a tax deductible piece to
Right.
donate to it, right? And so one of the things that I always run to is like there's a lot to the earlier version of our earlier part of our conversation where there are successful entrepreneurs who want to give back to entrepreneurs in their community. There's often not a very easy tax deductible way to do that in a community.
All right.
So their other option is just give entrepreneurs money, whether it's a grant or investment. That just gets complicated, and they're like, I don't want to deal with that. And so it's much easier to write a check to the school district or the arts program because there's an envelope at the theater, you stick it in and you plug it in and you get your tax deduction. But by creating a donor advised fund inside of a community foundation in your community for entrepreneurship, community vibrancy, economic development, however you want to frame it, there's now a single check process for anyone who wants to donate money to your ecosystem work. And it's tax deductible, which is also just makes it easier for people with high net worth to make a donation. And then remembering, and this is the part I only learned about spending time in foundations, there are millions of people in the world that need to write large checks every year because they don't want to pay taxes. And so they're going to write checks to somebody in your community. Some of those 67,000 millionaires in Nebraska are going to write checks to somebody, but a donor advised fund allows you a simple pathway, an address, and a place to write the check to, and then the donor advised fund, depending how you set it up, the decisions of how the funds can be made could come from a committee or an ecosystem coalition or a group of entrepreneurs who are helping guide it, and the money can be spent and guided by the community itself, and the donor simply has to make the donation. And it can be multiple donors, obviously, in a donor advised fund. Is that all fair assessment?
It's absolutely fair. And the other thing is, if we think about higher net worth, successful entrepreneurial families, most of them do estate planning. They have CPA and legal advice. And if they begin to get interested in this, begin to support it, what'll happen is when you get to that point, and I've seen this happen 100 times, where the community foundation has people who know how to work with high net worth donors. And that's when we would bring them in and say, okay, let's work with their CPA and their attorney. And part of this is timing. And this year, I need to make a major gift for tax purposes. So I'm going to make that initial gift to the endowment. And so what you're doing is you're getting into a collaboration with that family where they're, first of all, interested in what you're doing. But now you've got the opportunity to trigger a major gift because they need to do something, to your point, Andy, because of part of their estate plan, they've experienced substantial capital gains. They need to offset that. This all works out. Again, having the community foundation as a partner that has staff that can work with high net worth donor, they may only come into the community a few times a year. But of course, the foundation wants those assets too, because that's how they pay their bills. They're going to charge a little bit on hosting that fund. But it allows you then to really professionally work with that family and their advisors to secure that gift.
And what you're saying is they have staff at the community foundation that know how to talk to high net worth individuals and basically set up deals. I also
Absolutely.
think the other key thing to point out is if you have an endowed fund where there's a significant amount of money and not all of it's being spent every year, the foundation will help you invest that in other things to help that fund grow. You don't have to figure out how to invest your excess money. They literally have full-time human beings that do that work. And so the community foundation, if there's one in your community, you can walk in the front door and say, "Hey, I want to tell me about how to create a donor advised fund," and there'll be guides. There's probably information on their website. But creating one for entrepreneurship is sort of the entrepreneurship or ecosystem building or both or all as it's related is they'll help you set that up and frame it correctly. Obviously, they want you to help, fill the coffers. But if it's a big enough opportunity, it's also helpful because they're shopping around people in their community, in the community, who want to create wills and trusts and say, "Hey, there's already a fund that does this. You could just give to this," and so they're assisting with that as well. And so, community foundation is again, you called it funding technologies, the capital campaign, and the community foundation. Not new, not innovative in terms of ecosystem building, or maybe not innovative in terms of the
Raising
world
money.
for a while, but applying it to entrepreneurship and ecosystem building. So Tarsh is asking, can you just give an example of the donor advised fund, maybe Sydney, or if you want to jump to the Hutchins story, we can. Just tell, what does the fund actually fund? Like once it's been raised or something, like give us an example of what it actually funds.
So in Sydney, they agreed that they needed to invest and they wanted to hire and career track professional navigators and deal packagers. So they have 2 full-time positions, and that money primarily goes to support those 2 professionals. One who is a navigator. All AJ does is, but these are well-paid positions with benefits. And so, because again, they took Bob's lesson, we don't want turnover. We want to find the right people and grow them. And so AJ networks, meets with entrepreneurs, networks them to resources, but then they have a second person who actually is a financial packager. And she works primarily with the growth-oriented businesses that are trying to secure, different funding to put a package together to take the business to the next level. And she can work free of charge with these folks, helping them do financial packaging, which has contributed to some of their growth businesses. So in their case, it's all going into staffing. In other communities, these funds are also being used to capitalize gap financing that can be used with commercial banks and credit unions to help finance deals.
Awesome. In order to, don't they have a low interest when you say gap financing? Is that low interest loan fund? So if there's like the example I think Bob gave me was there was a shop downtown that needed a new roof. If they didn't have a new roof, they're going to have to shut down. So Bob and the team there said, let's put a deal together. We're going to give you a very low interest loan to fix your roof, to keep your business open. You're going to pay us back. It's going to go back into the fund, but that's gap financing, or that's one example of gap financing.
Yeah, and it can be low interest. Oftentimes, though, it's not. It's below what you would get at a bank. But the important thing is it's flexible. It's the last in capital. So for the bank, typically in ORD, their gap financing will only cover 20% of the deal. The bank will do 50, the entrepreneur will put some in, and then they have equity investors who will come in and maybe do the building improvements because they can use that as collateral. But having that flexible last in capital really helps you put together the deal with the more traditional funders. And so that's why it's such a powerful tool. I think it's an absolute in every community. In Sydney's case, they didn't do that because they already have regional gap financing programs that they could tap into. So they simply partner with those folks that already have that resource, saying, we don't need to use our money for that. We've got folks that already have that kind of capital, and we'll just partner with them. But we'll do all the legwork so that we're bringing them really good deals. It makes it easier for those gap financiers then to move that money with lower overhead cost. They love it.
Well, and I love the idea of running alongside the banks to de-risk a little bit of that and diversify the loan in case it doesn't work well. And one thing I learned from Bob at ORD is when you have a small town, it's fairly easy to get people on board. That's the advantage of a small town, is that everyone's connected and it's easy to get to everyone because there's only so many bankers and such. So two quick questions from Patty, then we're going to go to Kansas.
Yeah.
This one I think is easy. Does an org need to be a 501c3 to have a fund at a community foundation?
Not necessarily, but you need a 501c3 or equivalent to spend the money. Now, in ORD's case, they use intermediaries. So with their youth programs, they run them through the school, which is a 501c equivalent because it's a public school. In Sydney's case, the staff is hired through the public school system, and the office is through a public community college. And so neither of the core groups are 501c3s. They're all 501c6s, so they don't have charitable status, but they find partners where they can run the money through that makes it really easy. Most community foundations will not disperse directly to a 501c6 or 4. So you need to find those partners that align with the activity you're trying to do to actually funnel that money to the purposes that you're trying to do. But we found that to be fairly easy.
Patty, you can come off mute. Just you have a follow-up question. I don't
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my follow-up there is that, are those partners, is that like another word for fiscal sponsors?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Okay.
I think there's also an opportunity to think about it as like an ecosystem partner. So like a good example would be at the Kauffman Foundation. The Kauffman Foundation funded some money to go to people applying for those big federal grants. And so the Kauffman Foundation put money in the Community Foundation, which then transferred money over to nonprofits for helping make decisions, like making decisions about where the money's spent. So you're using the Community Foundation as the holder, and then there's a partner in the ecosystem who actually is the one who's doing the distribution. Like the example I think Don used, which is like the school system is literally administering the program. Is it valuable to the economic development group chamber? Yes, but it's not a direct program of theirs. It's a partner program. And so it's just, how do you set that constellation of multiple organizations?
Well, and I think, Patty, the other thing it does, to Andy's point, is to get the school to do that, the core E3 team, which is what they called themselves, they had to go meet with the school board. They had to meet with the administrators. And what's interesting is Sydney Public Schools was already doing a lot of youth entrepreneurship work and trades and other activities. they've invested far more since, because taking the time to explain why this is important helped the school board and the administration double down on the commitments they'd already made. And it takes time, it takes energy to do that, but it's a fundamental principle. You've got to sit down with these partners and get them engaged and figure out how they fit. Then they'll do more on their own. And that builds the ecosystem. So you have these bought-in stakeholder groups that are part of the system.
So, Don, you wouldn't believe it, we only have 10 minutes left, so we're going to try to get through a couple more things. I want to ask Dave asked a question. We're just going to change subjects for a bit, then we're going to come back to Kansas. He says, have you seen cases where proposing ideas of growth and change to an ecosystem are not heard unless it's from people from other communities? It's this notion you can't be a prophet in your own hometown. He says, I'm actively reaching out to 3 other communities like Tulsa, Austin, and Philly to accelerate our growth in Vegas.
Absolutely, Dave. Your intuition is spot on. I think there's this yin and yang of you've got to have championings locally, but if it's happened somewhere else, when Bob Stoll went and met with the leadership in Sydney, and they go, gosh, if this community of 2,000 can do this, we're, 3 times their size. We should be able to do it as well. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I'm not crazy.
No.
No, there's 100 people that registered for this webinar that would say you're spot on. So keep at it, Dave. Okay, Don, we're gonna have to do the lightning round on Hutchinson. I know you also have case stories on this, but give us the high level of the story there, and then because we're not gonna be able to get into all of it, and I want to finish with a couple questions. What's the innovation in Hutchinson that you learned there that someone could take away in thinking about funding their ecosystem? Tell us the Hutchinson story first.
So we've worked with Network Kansas, which is a statewide entrepreneurial ecosystem project for a long, long time. Rob knows it. Andy knows it. A number of you probably know it. Steve Radley and Eric Peterson. Steve particularly started working with the Hutchinson Community Foundation. They were part of an initiative that we did together around community development and philanthropy. How do we get economic development and philanthropy intentionally to work together to support entrepreneurs? And Hutchinson was one of the pilot communities that went through that 2-year institute process. Aubrey, who's their CEO and president, went back and goes, my gosh, we've got to do this. At the same time, there was already an entrepreneurship ecosystem effort with what's called Startup Hutch. So for Hutchinson, Hutch is the short name. And they were really struggling. They were getting some support from Network Kansas. They were getting a little bit of money from the community college. And Aubrey goes, we have donors who care about this. And so the neat thing about the Hutch story, and we don't have time to go into all the depths, but we've got some online about this, is this was the first time we really saw strategic intentionality where the convening partner was the community foundation that brought the chamber, the development corp, the city, the county, the tourism group, and Startup Hutch together and said, we are going to develop funding to do this. But also they're actually doing philanthropic investing. It's one of the few rural foundations I know of that's actually using philanthropic dollars to invest in businesses and projects. So the neat thing about Hutch is the model I laid out. This is the philanthropic piece where it's strategic, intentional, and it's generating impact.
And I think that really drives home the point too, that a community foundation leading the ecosystem effort is sort of, I would call it an innovation within the field. But I will also say something's in Kansas, because Network Kansas has been around for 20 years. Steve Radley and crew have been doing that for 20 years, getting people thinking in ecosystems. They use state funding, and I put a link in the chat, and some revolving loan funds. And then the Kansas Center for Community Foundation, Kansas Network for Community Foundations,
right,
had a track at their national gathering that was like, how can community foundations be entrepreneurial ecosystem builders?
Right.
And I know you work closely with Jeff Yost at the Nebraska Community Foundation. Mm-hmm. If there's someone out there is on this call, wants to get their community foundation involved, what would you recommend how they start that conversation. Let's assume their community foundation is an open, entrepreneurial-minded person, but maybe doesn't know a lot about entrepreneurship or ecosystems. How would you get a community foundation on board?
Well, I'll just put the offer out. Guys, I'm retiring, but I'm willing to give back. If you want to have a 30-minute chat to talk through, I'm happy to do that with you and then recommend resources. We've worked in almost every state with philanthropy over the years, and I'd be happy to take some time and just have a one-on-one chat. So, Andy, we can share my contact information. You might have to work it around my travel. But if that's fair game, I'm willing to give back some time to you all.
That's great. So, Don, so actually, audience, if you have any last questions for Don, put them in the chat and we'll do a lightning round at the end. But I want to go back to the beginning. Don, you have had a monumental career in economic development. And I wonder if you could tell us the story of how it started, because I think it's interesting. And then as you're coming to as you've been telling me for almost 5 years, I'm retiring, and I'm like, Don, you're still calling me though. What are your reflections on this work, and what do you need help with as you're going into your retirement? But start us at the beginning with your role at the governor's office, kind of that sparked your thinking and drove you into this 40-year career in entrepreneurial ecosystem. Before that was a word, before anybody thought in systems, before rural communities probably thought as much about entrepreneurship. But tell us the beginning stories, and just kind of give us some reflections on your time doing this work for almost 50 years.
So I grew up rural, guys, and I lived in 3 different communities. One which we experienced deep poverty because it was struggling, another one where we had opportunities. So there's always been this root in me to say communities should, at least like individuals, have the choice to achieve success. We should give them the chance to achieve success. And so when I was working for Governor Nelson, I was leading rural development, and we were very much engaged in traditional development in terms of attracting industry. And as I got on the inside of that game, 2 conclusions. One is I found it super expensive and high risk. And 2, for most rural communities, it wasn't even in the cards. They didn't have the workforce, the housing, the infrastructure to accommodate an industry relocation. And that's when I met Brian Dapson at the Corporation for Enterprise Development. And Brian was one of the early thought leaders and said, you should look at entrepreneurship and call Jay Kane at the Kauffman Foundation. And so we connected with Jay at the Kauffman Foundation, a predecessor to Andy, and goes, this makes a lot more sense. We had already been working with micro lending. And so there was that experience, but it was really driven by the idea that our current economic development policies were not working for way too many communities, particularly rural communities. We needed to find another answer, and that led down that lane to entrepreneurship as the answer. Not that I'm against industrial attraction, but let's be honest where it makes sense and doesn't make sense.
Given where we started, given where things were at when the Center of Rural Entrepreneurship, we started that in the 2000s, it spun out as some work out of Kauffman. Given when you hosted the Entrepreneurial Communities Conference along with Rob, SourceLink, Dale Gines, Federal Reserve Bank, Kansas City, Penny Lewandowski, all that in like 2015. How far have we come, or have we come far in thinking about entrepreneurship as economic and community, or community and economic development and ecosystem? But like, how do you feel about all of that? How far have we come? How do you feel about it?
I think the good news is we have proof of concept, and we've got thousands more engaged in this work. I mean, just think of the network with SourceLink, with Economic Gardening, your organization, Andy. So many more people are engaged in this, and we know how to actually help entrepreneurs, where, back in the 1990s, the answer at best was partial, at least in my experience. So that's the good news, is we have a movement, we have people, we've got demonstrated success. I think the one thing that continues to break my heart is we have not turned the curve with state governments across the country, who are still primarily spending most of their money on traditional economic development and spending way too little money on actually investing into community-based entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I'm no closer in Nebraska than I was when I started with Governor Nelson back in 1990. And it breaks my heart, but maybe someday we will turn the curve and actually put meaningful state money into this work.
Don, is there anything we can help you with as you move into the next phase of your life other than help you garden? Tell us ways we can help you.
Well, we're looking for a home for our resources, our website, and all of our stories. And so at some point, we're looking for somebody that not only would be willing to take on that resource, but the opportunity to bring it alive again, get people using the tools and contributing to it. It's a public good, and so that would be great. In the meantime, I'm more than motivated to give back, so I'm not looking to make money, but if a conversation with you could help, I'm willing to do it.
That's awesome, Don. We are so appreciative of you for taking the time to share your work and your stories. And we're going to wrap up in 20 seconds, but I just want to preview our next session in this series on June 19th. Mark Lawrence, the board chair of Startup Champions Network and the principal at Incubate, will be hosting Linda Olson, the founder of Tampa Bay Wave, really around startup ecosystem building. They've raised more than $1 billion for startups in Tampa, and there is a portfolio of programs that she has and her team have got funded. They have been very successful with federal grants, extremely successful with federal grants and government contracts. So Linda's going to share more of that story. Please share your thanks in the chat with Dawn, and we will wrap up here. The way we do it at EBLN is we are going to all unmute at the same time, and we're going to say goodbye in your language, culture, way of saying goodbye in your part of the world, wherever you're calling from, or just the way you do it at your house. And so if everyone could come off mute, and then on the count of three, we're just going to say, if you want to come off on screen, if you're able to do that, I'm just going to count to three and you're going to say goodbye in your language, culture, way of being, wherever you're from. So thank you for spending the time with us, 90 some minutes, and all that Don has to share. We will follow up with the slides, email everyone the slides and the video recording, and then we'll wrap up when on the count of three. 1, 2, 3.
Adios.
No. Bye.